I still remember that exact moment like it was frozen in time. I was standing at the end of the long mahogany conference table, carefully placing fresh copies of the acquisition documents into leather binders. The boardroom smelled of expensive coffee, polished wood, and power. CEO Nathan Carroll leaned back in his leather chair, flashing that smug grin I had seen 1,000 times before. "Gordon," he said, like my name was some kind of joke. "You're just the office clerk, not a lawyer. Maybe stick to making copies, yeah?" A few executives chuckled softly. I felt heat crawl up my neck, but I kept my face blank. I simply nodded and placed the binder in front of him with steady hands. I had been at Carroll Holdings for 10 long years. Started as a filing assistant, but over time, I became something else entirely. The quiet guy who remembered every clause, every date, every detail buried on page 200 of a 400-page contract. But none of that mattered to Nathan. In his eyes, I was just furniture. Useful, silent, and completely invisible. Today, that was about to change forever. The meeting was about our company's biggest acquisition yet. We were buying out a European logistics firm valued at $90 million. Everyone around that polished table was practically vibrating with excitement. The deal was set to close in exactly 1 week. Nathan, of course, would take all the credit when it went through. He always did. But as I handed him the contract draft for final review, I couldn't ignore the knot tightening in my chest. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "There's something in here you might want legal to double-check," I said quietly, tapping a section near the back of the document. Nathan barely glanced at it. He waved his hand dismissively. "Leave it, Gordon," he said without even looking up. "I don't pay you to think." I looked him straight in the eye. "It's a loophole. Page 312, subsection D. It technically allows third-party purchase rights under dormant license clauses." Nathan scoffed loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Gordon, please. I have 3 Harvard lawyers working on this deal. If they're not worried, I'm not worried." The room fell completely silent. Some executives smirked. Others looked away uncomfortably. I nodded once more. "Understood, sir." But inside, something had shifted forever. I had been at Carroll Holdings for 10 years. 10 long years of being treated like I didn't exist. 10 years of watching executives take credit for work I had done in the shadows. I started as a simple filing assistant, organizing documents and making copies. But over the years, I became something much more valuable. I was the guy who caught mistakes before they became disasters. The one who remembered contract details from 5 years ago. The person who actually read every single word of every single document. While lawyers skimmed through contracts looking for obvious problems, I studied them like sacred texts. I memorized clause numbers, cross-references, and legal footnotes that most people never even noticed. But to Nathan and his circle of executives, I was still just Gordon from filing. The quiet guy who brought coffee and made copies. They saw my job title and stopped thinking about what I actually knew. I had accepted the condescending comments for years. The subtle digs about my position. The glass ceiling that seemed impossible to break through. I told myself it was the price of staying in the game. But this moment felt different. This wasn't just arrogance anymore. This was dangerous negligence. And I wasn't going to let it slide this time. That night, I stayed late at the office under the pretense of organizing meeting notes. The cleaning crew walked past my desk without a second glance. After all, Gordon the clerk was always there, always invisible, always working late. But I wasn't organizing notes. I was reading every single word of that acquisition contract with laser focus. What I found in the fine print made my blood run cold. The dormant license clause was real and completely legal. It allowed any third party to assume licensing rights by paying a nominal fee and submitting a claim before the acquisition officially closed. The price? $1. Just one single dollar. It was a clause designed for emergencies, never meant to be triggered. But it hadn't been removed from the original contract template. No one had noticed it sitting there like a sleeping bomb. I stared at the legal text until well past midnight. My hands were trembling, but not with fear. With something much stronger and sharper. For the first time in 10 years, I realized where the real power was. It wasn't with the people sitting around that boardroom table. It was with the people who understood the fine print. I made a decision that night that would change everything. I wasn't reckless, and I definitely wasn't naive. I knew I needed a solid plan. More importantly, I needed perfect timing. The clock on the acquisition was ticking, and Nathan had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I called in a favor from an old college friend named Gordon who worked in corporate compliance at another firm. We met for coffee during my lunch break. The dormant license clause is binding, Gordon confirmed after reviewing the contract section I had photocopied. Absurd, yes, but completely binding under international trade law. He explained that the clause had been carried over from the original acquisition papers from 20 years ago. It had survived every ownership change and contract revision. If someone submits a formal claim and payment before the merger finalizes, they can assume the licensing rights of the company's core logistics software, Gordon said. Without that license, the whole acquisition would collapse. I wasn't a lawyer, but I didn't need to be. I just needed to follow the rules exactly as they were written. That afternoon, I prepared a $1 check and printed out the formal claim form. Everything was legal, transparent, and by the book. The trap was set. At exactly 12:47 p.m. during my lunch break, I walked to a nearby notary office. The elderly woman behind the desk had sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. I signed the form carefully, paid the small filing fee, and submitted my claim with all documents in perfect order. Then I paid the $1 fee in cash. The notary glanced at the figure and raised an eyebrow. $1? That's unusual. Hope this works out for you, she said with a slight smirk. I smiled back calmly. Me too. By the time I returned to the office, nothing seemed different. Nathan's assistant was gossiping with the marketing team. The CFO was on a call laughing about golf. Nathan himself was barking at someone about synergy optimization through his glass office wall. I sat down at my desk and typed a brief summary of my filing, sending it to my personal email for safekeeping. Then I waited. The clock on my computer screen ticked forward. Nothing happened. For the next 2 days, I started to wonder if I had imagined everything. Maybe I had misunderstood some crucial legal technicality. I had risked my job, my career, and possibly even a lawsuit. But I had also followed every rule perfectly. On the morning of the third day, I noticed the shift. At exactly 9:15 a.m., a lawyer from the acquisition firm stormed into Nathan's office. I couldn't hear the words, but their body language was tense and urgent. They spoke in low, clipped tones. Nathan's voice rose once in a sharp bark before dropping again. By noon, the entire legal team was huddled in the executive boardroom with the door closed. At 1:30 p.m., Nathan summoned the entire leadership team for an urgent update. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. I heard enough as people whispered in hallways. Fragments of conversations floated my way like pieces of a puzzle. Some kind of loophole claim. Who the hell filed it? The license is completely frozen. The deal can't close without it. I kept my head down at my desk, pretending not to listen. But inside, my heart was pounding with a strange mixture of disbelief and calm satisfaction. It was working. My plan was actually working. That afternoon, Nathan walked past my desk without even glancing at me. The man who had smirked at me just 3 days earlier wasn't smirking anymore. But this was far from over. I knew men like Nathan Carroll didn't fold quietly. The next morning, my phone buzzed before I even made it into the office building. The caller ID read Nathan Carroll. I stared at the screen for a long moment, thumb hovering over the answer button. Then I picked it up. "Gordon," he said, his voice sharp but coated with a thin layer of fake corporate politeness. "I need you in my office immediately." I smiled slightly, though he couldn't see it. "Of course, sir. I'll be right there." As I walked through the office toward that glass door, I felt every single gaze follow me. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People pretended to look at their computers while watching from the corners of their eyes. But this time, I didn't feel small or invisible. I felt ready. Nathan was about to learn something important. This was one office clerk who didn't just know the rules. I knew how to play them. Nathan's office felt colder than usual. Not because of the air conditioning, but because of the look on his face when I walked through the door. He stood by the window with his hands in his pockets, staring out at the city skyline like a general surveying a battlefield he was about to lose. I closed the door behind me with a soft click. The sound seemed to echo in the tense silence. "Gordon," Nathan said finally, turning to face me. His voice was calm and almost casual, but his eyes were ice cold. "Have a seat." I sat down in the chair across from his massive desk. He remained standing, trying to maintain the psychological advantage of height and position. "I've been told," he began slowly, that a dormant license claim has been filed against the Hanover acquisition. I said nothing. I just waited. His jaw tightened visibly. Imagine my surprise when I learned it was filed by my office clerk. I met his gaze steadily, keeping my expression completely neutral. I followed the process outlined in the original contract. It's a legal claim. Nathan let out a soft, humorless laugh. Legal or not, you had no right. You had no authority. You blindsided this company and jeopardized a $90 million acquisition. I kept my hands folded calmly in my lap. Actually, I exercised a public clause that your legal team overlooked. As of right now, I hold the licensing rights that Hanover requires to operate in this market. His eyes darkened with something that looked almost like rage. What exactly are you playing at, Gordon? I blinked slowly. Nothing, sir. I'm simply ensuring my rights according to the agreement terms. For a long moment, Nathan said absolutely nothing. The silence stretched between us like a wire about to snap. Then, with a low chuckle, he circled around behind his desk and sat down. He folded his hands like a poker player about to raise the stakes. You want money? He asked bluntly. I tilted my head slightly. Excuse me. He gave me that sharp, predatory smile I had seen him use in negotiations. Come on, Gordon. Let's not pretend here. You saw an opportunity to grab a piece of this deal. Fine. I respect the hustle. Name your price. I'll buy you out of this little stunt. Clean and quiet. I held his gaze without flinching. I didn't file the claim for money. His confident smile faltered for the first time. Then what do you want? I leaned forward slightly in my chair. I filed it because you dismissed me like I didn't exist. You made a choice to ignore my warning. The same way you've ignored every person in this company who wasn't sitting at your executive table. Nathan's face was turning red now. I'm not here to negotiate, Nathan. I'm here because this isn't your game to win by default anymore. For the first time in 10 years, I saw his confidence waver completely. You realize, Nathan said slowly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, that this will not end well for you. I nodded calmly. I realize it won't end well for you either. We stared at each other across his expensive desk in complete silence. The air between us felt razor-sharp with tension. Finally, he leaned back in his leather chair. You'll regret this, Gordon. I gave him a small, polite smile. I'll take my chances. I stood up and walked toward the door with steady steps. His voice stopped me just as I reached for the handle. You think you're smarter than me? I turned back to meet his gaze one final time. No, Nathan. I think I read the fine print. Then I walked out and closed the door behind me. The hours after our confrontation felt completely surreal. I returned to my desk with my heart pounding, acting like nothing had happened. The office had become a sea of hushed voices and darting glances. Word travels fast in corporate hallways, especially when the office clerk walks into the CEO's office and comes out alive. By late afternoon, the company's legal team was scrambling. I could see them rushing between meetings with thick folders and worried expressions. The first blow landed before I even left the building that day. At exactly 5:03 p.m., an email popped up in my inbox from Human Resources. Subject line: Formal inquiry into conduct. Immediate response required. I opened it with steady hands and a calm pulse. They were launching an investigation into me for unauthorized interference with corporate contractual agreements. I almost laughed out loud. Almost. I had seen this exact tactic before. It was a classic move in corporate chess. Smear the opponent, discredit them, make them look like a rogue actor before they can build any kind of defense. But I was ready for this. I immediately forwarded the email to my attorney. Yes, I had hired one 2 days ago. I wasn't walking into this battle unarmed. Nathan thought this was still his game to control. He hadn't realized yet that I had already flipped the entire board. The HR inquiry wasn't a surprise, but what came next definitely was. The next morning, I arrived at the office early, wanting to stay ahead of whatever Nathan had planned for me. The first thing I noticed was my computer screen. Instead of my usual desktop, a red error message blinked back at me. Access restricted. Please contact IT support. I took a slow, deep breath. The game was escalating exactly as I had expected. At 8:13 a.m., I received a call from Human Resources requesting my immediate presence for a follow-up meeting. 2 people were waiting for me in the conference room. One was the head of HR, a woman named Victoria with carefully styled gray hair. The other was a corporate counsel I had never seen before, wearing an expensive suit and a grim expression. "We've temporarily suspended your system access," Victoria began, folding her hands neatly on the polished table. "This is pending our investigation into recent concerns raised by the executive office." I nodded calmly. Concerns relating to a lawful, documented license claim that I filed personally, using my own resources outside of company time and property. A flicker of discomfort crossed her face. "We're simply following standard protocol, Gordon." I leaned back in my chair with complete confidence. "So am I." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a letter. It was signed by my attorney and printed on official letterhead. I handed it across the table to them. The letter formally stated that any retaliatory action taken against me, including restricting access, assigning blame without evidence, or creating a hostile work environment, would be met with immediate legal response. The corporate counsel's lips pressed into a thin, tight line as he read it. "Is that a threat, Mr. Cross?" he asked. I met his gaze evenly. "No, it's a fact." By noon that day, the whispers in the office had grown much louder. I caught fragments of conversations as I walked through the hallways. "HR's going after him now. He's completely finished. Crazy move, but he's done for." I walked past them all, keeping my expression neutral and professional. I knew exactly how this game worked. Nathan was trying to push me out before the board of directors or shareholders could get wind of what had really happened. If I walked away now, it would confirm every accusation they wanted to make. Unauthorized conduct, insubordination, breach of trust. But I wasn't walking away. Not this time. At 2 p.m., I met with my attorney in a small cafe 2 blocks from the office. His name was Benjamin Walsh, and he was sharp, methodical, and not interested in theatrics. Exactly the kind of lawyer you want when facing a corporate machine. He slid a manila folder across the table to me. "We're filing a preemptive injunction," he explained calmly. "If they move against you in any way, they'll have to explain everything in open court. Public record." I opened the folder and glanced over the legal documents. "Nathan won't risk that kind of exposure," I said quietly. My attorney smiled slightly. "That's exactly the point." The next day, the atmosphere at Carroll Holdings had shifted completely. The tension didn't dissolve, it actually got thicker. But this time, it wasn't directed at me. It was focused squarely on Nathan. Word was starting to leak throughout the company. People were asking uncomfortable questions. How did an office clerk file a binding legal claim? Why hadn't the expensive legal team caught such an obvious problem? Why was human resources scrambling like this? The CFO actively avoided eye contact with me when we passed in the hallway. 2 vice presidents whispered urgently to each other and stopped talking the moment they saw me approaching. And then, late that afternoon, something happened that I honestly didn't expect. My desk phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and completely unfamiliar. "Gordon, this is Richard Clark, chairman of the board. I believe we need to have a conversation." 20 minutes later, I sat across from him in a glass-walled conference room on the top floor of the building. Unlike Nathan, Richard didn't try to intimidate or posture. He simply listened. For 20 straight minutes, I laid out everything. The ignored warning, the contract loophole, Nathan's dismissal and public humiliation, the legal filing, the retaliation campaign. I presented every detail with supporting documents, keeping my voice calm, factual, and completely professional. When I finished my explanation, Richard sat back in his chair with his hands steepled under his chin. "You've put us in a very difficult position," he said finally. I met his eyes directly. "No, sir. Nathan did that when he ignored a legitimate legal concern. I followed the law. The company's leadership chose to ignore it." He exhaled slowly and nodded. "You're not wrong about that." A long pause stretched between us. Richard seemed to be weighing his words very carefully. "You've given us a lot to consider," he said. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't speak to the press in the meantime." I gave him a small, polite smile. "I'm not looking for headlines, Mr. Clark. I'm looking for accountability." He nodded again, slower this time. "Understood." As I stood to leave, he spoke quietly. "We'll be in touch." By the time I left the building that evening, the office felt like a cracked facade, still standing, but ready to collapse at any moment. Nathan thought this was a game of intimidation and corporate power, but he had forgotten one crucial thing. You can't intimidate someone who has nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. And I had been building my case for 10 long years. By Monday morning, the office no longer felt like the same place. It wasn't anything obvious or dramatic. No sudden announcements, no emergency meetings, no security escorts. But you could sense the change in the air, in the clipped conversations, in the nervous glances, in the way people moved through the hallways. The entire corporate ecosystem had shifted overnight. Nathan wasn't holding court in his glass office like usual. His door, which was normally wide open for anyone to see him commanding the room, was closed tight with the blinds drawn. Richard Clerk, the chairman of the board, was on site. All morning long, meetings were shuffled. Calendar invites were changed. Executives were called upstairs for private discussions that lasted hours. The Human Resources Department kept their heads down and avoided eye contact with everyone. The legal department moved in and out of the boardroom like silent messengers carrying bad news. I watched it all unfold from my desk, staying careful and quiet. By noon, rumors were swirling through every department like wildfire. Emergency board review. Major compliance breach. Carol's future is in serious question. I didn't feed the rumors. I didn't need to. This time, I wasn't part of the office gossip network. I was at the center of the storm. At exactly 2:15 p.m., I got the call I had been waiting for. Boardroom. Now. The voice belonged to Richard Clerk's executive assistant. Her tone was professional but tense. I stood up from my desk, smoothed down my blazer, and walked the long corridor toward the executive suite. The glass walls reflected my image as I passed, calm, composed, exactly as I wanted to appear. When I entered the boardroom, every single member of the board of directors was seated around the massive conference table. Nathan sat at the far end, as far from the door as possible. His face was tight, his jaw clenched, his arms crossed defensively over his chest. Richard gestured for me to sit directly across from him, with one empty chair between Nathan and myself. I nodded politely and took my seat. The room fell into complete silence. You could have heard a pin drop. Then Richard spoke in a clear, measured voice. We've reviewed all the documents Ms. Harris provided, along with statements from legal, HR, and compliance. We've also consulted with outside counsel. He looked around the table. A few board members nodded grimly. This acquisition has been jeopardized by a critical oversight. That much is undeniable. The question before us now is how we handle both the business implications and the internal leadership issues that led us to this point. A murmur rippled through the board members like a wave. Richard turned to face me directly. Mr. Cross, you filed a legal claim as a private individual using your own personal resources. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Were any company resources used in this process? No, sir. Did you act on proprietary information that was not available in public records? I shook my head firmly. The clause I acted on was part of the original acquisition agreement, which is a public document accessible through corporate filings. Richard nodded once. Thank you. He turned to Nathan, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. And you, Mr. Carroll, were made aware of this potential legal issue prior to the claim being filed. Nathan's jaw tightened visibly. He started to speak, but Richard cut him off. Yes or no? Nathan's nostrils flared. Yes. Did you investigate this concern or escalate it to legal counsel? Nathan hesitated for a long moment, then muttered, I dismissed it. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Noted. The next hour was like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. The board systematically reviewed Nathan's mishandling of the deal, his refusal to escalate legitimate concerns, his attempt to retaliate through human resources, the formal legal complaint I had submitted through my attorney. Every single step Nathan had taken to discredit me was now being used as evidence against him. He tried desperately to defend himself. He made excuses, told half-truths, and tried to shift blame to his legal team. He even suggested that I had acted out of spite or personal vendetta. But the board wasn't buying any of it. And the beautiful thing was, I didn't need to say much of anything. The facts spoke louder than any defense I could have given. The documents told the story. The timeline was crystal clear. The retaliation was obvious and documented. Finally, Richard delivered the verdict in the same calm, measured tone he had used throughout the entire meeting. Effective immediately, Nathan Carroll is placed on administrative leave pending further board review. We will appoint interim leadership until a final decision is made regarding his position with this company. Nathan opened his mouth to protest, but Richard raised his hand and silenced him completely. You may collect your personal belongings under supervision. Your access to all company systems and facilities is revoked as of right now. Nathan's face turned a deep shade of crimson. Nathan shot me a look across the table. Not angry this time. Pure disbelief. I met his eyes with steady, calm confidence. For once in 10 years, he had absolutely no words. When the board meeting officially adjourned, Richard pulled me aside for a private conversation. You handled yourself with professionalism and remarkable restraint, he said quietly. I respect that approach. Thank you, sir. He gave me a small nod of approval. We're going to need your help navigating the fallout from this situation. Hanover's attorneys are already asking very pointed questions. I'll be ready, I said, and I meant every word of it. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about doing what Nathan had never understood, protecting the company by doing the right thing. The official announcement came exactly 2 days later. Nathan Carroll was stepping down from his position as CEO, citing personal reasons. There was no press release, no farewell statement, no golden parachute ceremony. Just a quiet internal memo that landed in everyone's inbox before 9 a.m. But nobody in the office believed the official story. The real version spread through whispered conversations and knowing glances. The board had pushed him out. The acquisition had nearly collapsed. And somehow, the quiet office clerk had been at the center of it all. I stayed completely silent about the details. I wasn't interested in office gossip or taking victory laps. What mattered now was saving the deal. With Nathan gone, the Hanover acquisition moved forward under completely different leadership. The board appointed Richard Clerk as interim CEO, and he insisted on assembling a revised negotiation team. To my genuine surprise, he asked me to be part of it. Not as a token assistant, not as a silent note-taker, as a recognized advisor with real authority. You've proven that you understand what's truly at stake here, Richard said during our first strategy session. And you know better than most people how to read between the lines of these contracts. I accepted the position, but with clear conditions. I wasn't going to be a figurehead or a symbolic gesture. I wanted genuine authority on compliance checks and contractual oversight. I wanted the autonomy to speak up without having to push through layers of bureaucracy or executive ego. To my amazement, Richard agreed without any hesitation. Consider it done, he said. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked side by side with our legal team, reviewing every single inch of the acquisition paperwork with a fine-tooth comb. Hanover's attorneys were cautious but cooperative, especially after learning exactly what had almost derailed the entire deal. When we finally closed the Hanover acquisition, it was completely airtight. No loopholes, no oversights, no ego-driven mistakes that could come back to haunt us later. The deal actually made headlines in industry trade publications. Not because of its size, but because of the quiet shift in how it had been handled. For once, a major corporate acquisition had been closed with complete integrity and without burying mistakes under layers of corporate spin. One evening, after all the final documents had been signed and filed, I found myself alone in the conference room where this whole story had started. I stood there staring out at the city skyline, thinking about the past 10 years. 10 years of being underestimated, dismissed, and completely overlooked. I had started this job thinking that hard work alone would eventually earn respect. I learned the hard way that it doesn't. Sometimes you have to show respect. Claim it. Stand firm when others expect you to fold quietly. And most importantly, you have to know your own worth before anyone else will recognize it. Richard joined me a few minutes later, holding 2 cups of coffee. He offered one to me. You know, he said, settling into a chair across from me. The board has been having some very interesting discussions about your future here. I raised an eyebrow. That sounds potentially ominous. He smiled faintly. Actually, quite the opposite. We want you to stay on permanently, Richard continued. Not just for compliance work on special projects. We're creating an entirely new position in the company structure. I waited for him to continue. Director of Risk and Contract Strategy. Reports directly to the executive board. Full authority over all major deal compliance. I blinked in surprise. That's a real position? He chuckled softly. It is now. I exhaled slowly, letting the reality sink in. Why me? His smile faded into something completely sincere. Because you didn't just protect this company from a potential financial disaster, Gordon. You protected it from itself. And you did it without seeking credit, revenge, or personal gain. I studied his face for a moment, looking for any sign that this was some kind of elaborate corporate game. But his expression was genuine. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I accept." He nodded with satisfaction. "You earned it." The next morning, I moved into my new office. It was a modest space with no corner windows and no grand nameplate on the door, and I was completely fine with that. This wasn't about status symbols or executive perks. It was about having a real voice in the process and making sure that no one else in this company would ever have to fight alone just to be heard. As for Nathan, the last I heard, he had taken a consulting position with a smaller firm on the West Coast. Fewer employees, smaller deals, less media attention. Maybe he learned something from the experience. Maybe he didn't. That wasn't my concern anymore. Some battles you fight for survival. Some you fight for principle. And some you fight simply because walking away means accepting that things will never change, even when you know they should be better. I never set out to win a corporate war or destroy anyone's career. I just refused to lose quietly. I refused to let incompetence and arrogance put the company at risk. I refused to be invisible anymore. The $1 check I had written to claim those licensing rights was the best investment I ever made. Not because it made me money, but because it forced everyone to finally see what had been right in front of them for 10 years. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one with the biggest title or the corner office. Sometimes it's the person who actually reads the fine print. And in the end, that made all the difference in the world.